For 2 years he'd been invisible, just another janitor pushing a mop while champions trained around him. Then a drunk patron threw the first punch, and everyone in that gym witnessed what happens when you corner a man who'd spent 15 years teaching special forces how to fight with nothing but their bare hands. Welcome to Retired Soldier Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden strength and forgotten glory, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe every warrior deserves to have their story told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who fought in shadows and now work in silence. The Iron Temple Boxing Gym sat in the industrial district of downtown, squeezed between a tire shop and a warehouse that stored more dust than inventory. The building had been many things over the decades: a machine shop during the war, a dance hall in the 50s, a storage facility when the neighborhood went quiet. But for the last 15 years, it had been sanctuary for fighters, dreamers, and anyone tough enough to step through its doors. The gym opened at 5 a.m. and closed when the last person left, sometimes after midnight. The walls were lined with faded photographs of champions, local heroes, and young men who'd found their way through life with gloved fists and disciplined hearts. Heavy bags hung like sleeping giants from the reinforced ceiling. Speed bags drummed their endless rhythm, and the ring in the center commanded respect from everyone who entered. That's where Eddie Morales had worked for 2 years now, not as a trainer, not as a fighter, just as the man who cleaned up after everyone else's dreams. Eddie arrived every morning at 4:30 a.m., a full 30 minutes before the gym officially opened. He wore the same uniform every day: dark blue coveralls with maintenance stitched over the pocket, steel-toed boots that had seen better decades, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shade his eyes. He was 62 years old, walked with a slight limp that favored his left leg, and spoke only when spoken to, which wasn't often. The fighters called him Old Eddie when they remembered his name at all. Most of the time, he was just part of the background, the guy who mopped up their sweat, restocked the towels, and fixed whatever equipment they broke. He never complained about the long hours, never asked for overtime pay, and never stayed to watch the evening matches that drew crowds from across the city. What nobody knew was that Eddie Morales had a different name once: Staff Sergeant Eduardo Iron Fist Morales, United States Army Special Forces, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Military boxing champion 1985 through 2000. Record: 127 fights, 127 victories, 89 knockouts. Hand-to-hand combat instructor for Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and Rangers. The man who'd taught some of America's most elite warriors how to win fights that couldn't be won with bullets. But that was a lifetime ago. Before his knees gave out, before his wife passed away, before the nightmares made sleep impossible, and the only peace he could find was in the rhythmic motion of a mop against linoleum floor. The gym's regulars had their routines, and Eddie knew them all. Marcus Thunder Johnson came in at 5:15 a.m. sharp, 30-year-old heavyweight with dreams of a title shot and the work ethic to earn it. He was respectful to Eddie, always said good morning, sometimes asked about his weekend. Then came the college kids around 6 a.m., pre-med students and business majors who thought boxing would teach them toughness. They were polite enough, though they looked through Eddie like he was transparent. The afternoon crowd was different. Younger, hungrier, some with more attitude than skill. They trained hard but talked harder, always ready to prove themselves to anyone who'd listen. Tommy Restrepo was their unofficial leader. 24 years old, fast hands, faster mouth, and the kind of confidence that came from winning amateur tournaments against other guys who'd never been hit by someone who really knew how to hurt people. "Yo, old Eddie," Tommy called out one Tuesday afternoon as Eddie emptied the trash near the heavy bags. "You ever actually fight? Or you just clean up after real fighters?" Eddie looked up briefly, made eye contact for exactly 1 second, then went back to his work. "Just clean," he said quietly. Tommy laughed, loud enough for his training partners to hear. "That's what I figured. No offense, old man, but you don't exactly look like championship material." Eddie tied off the trash bag, lifted it with both hands, and walked toward the dumpster behind the building. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man whose body remembered violence but whose spirit had made peace with being invisible. What Tommy couldn't see, what none of them could see, were the scars on Eddie's knuckles. Not the casual marks that came from bag work or sparring, but the deep, deliberate scars that came from breaking jaws, crushing ribs, and ending fights against men who'd been trained to kill with their bare hands. The military had taught Eddie that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the most dangerous man nobody noticed. For 15 years, Eddie had been the ghost who shaped killers. When a Navy SEAL needed to learn how to disable an enemy twice his size with nothing but his fists, they called Eddie. When a Delta Force operator had to survive hand-to-hand combat behind enemy lines, Eddie taught him how. When the Pentagon needed someone to test their close-quarters combat protocols, Eddie was the man who broke their systems and built them stronger. His military record was still classified, buried in files that would never see daylight, but the men he'd trained knew his name, spoke it with reverence in places where conversations weren't recorded, and legends were passed down through whispered stories. "Iron Fist Morales," they'd say. "Iron Fist Morales," they'd say. The man who could end any fight in under 30 seconds and did it 127 times without ever losing. But that Eddie Morales had retired with full honors in 2000. This Eddie Morales just wanted to mop floors in peace. The trouble started on a Friday night in late October. The gym was hosting an amateur tournament, nothing fancy but well attended by local fight fans. The main event featured Marcus Johnson against a visiting heavyweight from Atlanta, and the crowd was bigger than usual. Eddie had planned to finish his cleaning and leave before the fight started, but a broken pipe in the men's locker room had kept him late. By 9 p.m., the tournament was in full swing. The crowd was loud. Beer was flowing despite the no alcohol signs posted around the gym, and the atmosphere was electric with the kind of energy that came when violence was sanctioned and celebrated. Eddie was in the back storage room, organizing supplies and trying to stay out of the way. That's when he heard the shouting from the main floor. At first, it sounded like normal crowd noise, cheering, jeering, the usual chaos that surrounded amateur boxing matches. But Eddie's ears were trained to distinguish between celebration and confrontation, and what he was hearing now was definitely the latter. He walked to the storage room door and peered out. Near the ring, a crowd had gathered around what looked like an argument. At the center of it was a man Eddie didn't recognize. Mid-30s, thick build, beer bottle in his hand, and the kind of aggressive posture that preceded bad decisions. "I said that was a lucky punch." The stranger was shouting at Marcus Johnson, who was still in his boxing trunks after winning his fight. "Your boy here wouldn't last 2 minutes against a real fighter." Marcus, to his credit, was trying to de-escalate. "Hey man, it's all good. Just a fight, you know. No need to make it personal." But the drunk stranger wasn't interested in peace. "You calling me a liar? You saying I don't know fighting when I see it?" That's when Tommy Restrepo stepped in, still riding the adrenaline from his own victory earlier in the evening. "Why don't you shut up and get out of here before security throws you out?" The stranger turned toward Tommy, and Eddie could see the shift in his body language. This wasn't just a drunk fan running his mouth anymore. This was a man who'd decided that violence was the only way to settle whatever grievance he thought he had. "You want to go, pretty boy?" the stranger said, dropping his beer bottle. It shattered on the concrete floor, and the sharp sound cut through the crowd noise like a gunshot. "Let's see how tough you are without gloves and..." Eddie watched from the storage room doorway as the situation spiraled beyond words. The stranger threw the first punch, a wild, telegraphed right hand that Tommy saw coming from across the city. Tommy slipped it easily and countered with a quick jab that snapped the stranger's head back. But the stranger wasn't alone. 3 more men emerged from the crowd, and Eddie realized this wasn't a random drunk causing trouble. This was planned. The stranger was wearing steel-toed boots and had scars on his knuckles that suggested he was more experienced with street fighting than his sloppy first punch had indicated. His friends moved with the coordination of men who'd done this before. "Get him!" the stranger shouted, and suddenly the gym erupted into chaos. Tommy was fast and skilled, but he was also 24 years old and had never been in a real fight. The kind where rules didn't exist, and your opponent's goal wasn't to win points, but to put you in the hospital. He managed to drop one of the attackers with a clean right cross, but the other 2 flanked him while the stranger picked up a piece of the broken beer bottle. Marcus tried to help, but he was exhausted from his own fight and still wearing boxing gloves that made grappling impossible. The gym security, Two part-time guys who were more suited for checking IDs than stopping riots were overwhelmed and calling for backup that wouldn't arrive for at least 10 minutes. That's when Eddie stepped out of the storage room. He moved differently now. The careful shuffle was gone, replaced by something fluid and purposeful. His limp had vanished, and his shoulders carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from muscle memory older than some of the fighters in the gym. "Hey!" Eddie called out, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "That's enough." The stranger turned toward him, beer bottle still in his hand, and laughed. "What's this? Grandpa wants to play hero." Eddie didn't respond. He simply walked closer, each step measured and deliberate. The crowd sensed something was happening, and the noise level dropped as people turned to watch the aging janitor face down four men half his age. "Old man, you better walk away before you get hurt," one of the stranger's friends said. "This ain't your fight." Eddie stopped about 10 feet away from the group, close enough to see the broken glass in the stranger's hand, far enough to have options. His stance was casual, relaxed, like a man waiting for a bus rather than facing down a potential life or death situation. "It became my fight when you brought weapons into my gym," Eddie said quietly. The stranger laughed again. "Your gym? You're just the janitor, old man. Stick to mopping floors." Eddie nodded slowly. "You're right, I am just the janitor. But before that, I was something else." He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that told stories. Scars from knife fights, burn marks from explosions, and tattoos that anyone with military experience would recognize immediately. But it was his hands that made Tommy Restrepo's eyes widen with sudden understanding. Eddie's knuckles were covered in scar tissue. The kind that came from hitting things harder than bones were meant to hit. His fingers moved with the fluid precision of a pianist, and when he made fists, the sound of his joints cracking echoed through the suddenly quiet gym like distant thunder. "I spent 15 years teaching Special Forces soldiers how to fight," Eddie said, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made everyone within earshot pay attention. "Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Rangers, the kind of men who have to win fights where losing means dying." The stranger's confidence wavered slightly, but alcohol and pride kept him from backing down. "I don't give a damn what you used to be, old man. This is what you are now." He lunged forward with the broken bottle, aiming for Eddie's face with the kind of wild aggression that worked in bar fights against civilians who'd never learned how to handle real violence. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds. Eddie moved like water flowing around rocks. He stepped inside the stranger's attack, caught his wrist with his left hand, and drove his right elbow into the man's solar plexus with surgical precision. The stranger doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and Eddie relieved him of the bottle with a wrist control technique that left the attacker's arm hanging useless at his side. Before the stranger hit the ground, Eddie was already moving toward the second man. This one was smarter, kept his distance, tried to circle around and attack from behind. But Eddie had spent years fighting multiple opponents in scenarios where hesitation meant death. He feinted left, spun right, and delivered a back fist that caught the second attacker in the temple. The man dropped like his power had been unplugged. The third attacker had a knife. Eddie saw it coming out of the man's jacket pocket and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept him alive through dozens of real combat situations. Time slowed down, and his mind automatically calculated angles, distances, and probabilities. The knife was a cheap folding blade, held by someone who'd watched too many movies and thought he knew how to use it. Eddie closed the distance before the man could fully extend the blade. He trapped the knife hand against his attacker's body, drove a knee into his liver, and applied a blood choke that put the man to sleep in less than 5 seconds. The knife clattered harmlessly to the floor. The fourth man had seen enough. He was already backing toward the exit when Eddie turned toward him, hands still held in a relaxed fighting stance that somehow managed to look more threatening than any aggressive posture could have achieved. "Walk away," Eddie said simply. The man walked away. The entire gym was silent now, except for the sound of 3 men groaning on the floor and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Eddie stood in the center of it all, breathing normally, not even sweating despite having just dismantled 4 attackers in less time than it took most people to tie their shoes. Tommy Restrepo stared at him with something approaching awe. "Jesus Christ, Eddie. Where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" Eddie looked around the gym, taking in the faces of fighters he'd cleaned up after for 2 years, men who thought they knew what toughness looked like, who'd measured their worth in amateur tournament victories and training montages. Now they were seeing something different, the kind of violence that was practiced by men who fought for countries rather than trophies. Fort Bragg, Eddie said quietly. 15 years teaching soldiers how to come home alive. Marcus Johnson, still wearing his boxing gloves, stepped forward. Eddie, man, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever say anything? Eddie bent down and picked up his baseball cap, which had fallen off during the brief fight. He placed it back on his head, pulling the brim low over his eyes. Because I didn't come here to fight, he said. I came here to find peace. The police arrived 10 minutes later, followed by paramedics who checked on the 3 unconscious men. The attackers were arrested, charges were filed, and statements were taken. Eddie answered questions in the same quiet voice he'd used to ask if anyone needed fresh towels, giving facts without commentary or embellishment. The gym owner, Mike Castellanos, had arrived halfway through the police interviews. He was a former middleweight contender who'd opened the Iron Temple after his own career ended, and he prided himself on knowing fighters when he saw them. But he'd employed Eddie for 2 years without recognizing what was standing right in front of him. Eddie, Mike said after the police had left. We need to talk. They sat in Mike's office, a cluttered space filled with fight posters, trophies from Mike's competition days, and stacks of paperwork that represented the business side of running a gym. Eddie sat across from the desk, hands folded in his lap, waiting. I did some research while you were talking to the cops, Mike said, holding up his phone. Staff Sergeant Eduardo Morales, U.S. Army Special Forces, military boxing champion, 127-0 record. Hand-to-hand combat instructor. Jesus, Eddie, you're a legend. Eddie shrugged. I was a soldier. Now I'm a janitor. But why? Mike leaned forward, genuinely confused. With your background, your skills, you could be training champions. You could have your own gym, write books, do seminars. Why are you mopping my floors? Eddie was quiet for a long moment, looking past Mike toward the window that faced the main floor of the gym. Out there, fighters were already back to their routines. The broken glass had been swept up. The equipment had been checked for damage, and the rhythm of training had resumed as if nothing had happened. You know what I did for 15 years, Mike? Eddie finally asked. I taught young men how to kill people with their bare hands. I turned college kids into weapons, showed them how to end lives in ways that wouldn't show up in autopsy reports. I was good at it. Maybe too good. Maybe too good. He paused, still looking out the window. When I retired, I thought I'd miss the action, the adrenaline, the respect, the feeling of being the best at something that mattered. But you know what I actually missed? Mike waited. Quiet, Eddie said. I missed being able to wake up in the morning without wondering if the techniques I taught yesterday were being used to kill someone today. I missed being around people who fought for sport instead of survival. He turned back toward Mike. This gym, these fighters, they remind me why I fell in love with boxing in the first place. It's not about killing. It's about discipline, respect, pushing yourself to be better than you were yesterday. When I mop these floors, when I clean up after guys like Tommy and Marcus, I'm part of something pure again. Mike leaned back in his chair, processing. But tonight was different, Eddie said. Those men brought real violence into a place that's supposed to be safe. They threatened people I care about, so I stopped being invisible for 4 seconds and became what I used to be. And now? Eddie stood up slowly, his limp returning as the adrenaline fully faded from his system. Now I go back to being the janitor, if that's okay with you. Mike stared at him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, Eddie. That's okay with me. The next morning, Eddie arrived at 4:30 a.m. as usual. He wore his dark blue coveralls, steel-toed boots, and baseball cap pulled low. He cleaned the locker rooms, restocked the towels, and prepared the gym for another day of fighters chasing their dreams. But something had changed. When Tommy Restrepo arrived for his morning training session, he stopped by the storage room where Eddie was organizing supplies. Hey, Eddie, Tommy said. his usual cocky attitude replaced by something that looked like respect. "I wanted to thank you for last night, and I wanted to apologize for all the stupid things I said about you not being a real fighter." Eddie looked up from his inventory clipboard. "Nothing to apologize for. You didn't know." "But I should have," Tommy said. "Mike told us about your record. 127-0. Jesus, man, you're like the best fighter who ever lived, and I was treating you like a janitor." Eddie finished with a slight smile. "Which is what I am." Tommy shook his head. "No, man, you're way more than that. And if you ever wanted to teach some of us some of that real fighting stuff, I think a lot of guys here would be interested." Eddie set down his clipboard and looked at Tommy for a long moment. The young fighter was sincere, eager, and talented enough to benefit from real instruction. But he was also the kind of young man Eddie had spent 15 years turning into a weapon. "Boxing teaches you everything you need to know about fighting," Eddie said finally. "Discipline, respect, conditioning, technique. The other stuff I know, that's not for gyms like this. That's for when sport becomes survival. And I hope you never need to learn the difference." Tommy nodded, though Eddie could see he didn't fully understand. That was okay. Understanding came with experience, and Eddie hoped Tommy would never get that kind of experience. Over the following weeks, word spread through the local fighting community about what had happened at the Iron Temple. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, until Eddie had supposedly defeated 10 armed attackers using nothing but ancient military secrets and superhuman reflexes. Eddie ignored the attention. He continued arriving at 4:30 a.m., continued cleaning up after fighters who now treated him with a mixture of awe and confusion, and continued finding peace in the routine of making sure other people had a clean, safe place to pursue their dreams. But late at night, when the gym was empty and quiet, Eddie would sometimes walk out to the main floor and stand near the heavy bags. He'd remember what it felt like to be 25 years old and unbeatable, to step into a ring knowing that defeat wasn't just unlikely but impossible. He'd remember the weight of gloves on his hands, the roar of crowds who understood they were watching something special, and the satisfaction that came from perfect technique executed under pressure. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They were just part of who he'd been, like chapters in a book that had ended well even if it hadn't ended the way he'd expected. Eddie Morales had been many things in his 62 years. A soldier, a champion, a teacher, a weapon. But in the quiet hours of the early morning, mopping floors in a gym where fighters came to chase their dreams, he'd found something he'd never been before. He'd found peace, and sometimes, for men who'd spent their lives in war, peace was the greatest victory of all. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Eddie? Someone whose quiet strength runs deeper than their humble job title suggests? Someone who chooses service over recognition, peace over glory? Share their story in the comments, because heroes don't always wear uniforms or stand on podiums. Sometimes they wear coveralls and carry mops, and their greatest victory is the battle nobody sees, the one they fight every day to choose healing over hurt, building over breaking. Thank you for watching Retired Soldier Stories. If this tale of hidden valor moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who fight their greatest battles in silence. Until next time, remember that real strength isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about being kind enough that nobody ever has to find out.